Robert F. Kennedy Jr. has been arrested for possession of heroin after an alleged overdose.
Yet another loss. Mary Kennedy, the estranged wife of Robert Kennedy Jr.
I think most people don't know what my stance is on vaccines. I've never been anti-vaccine.
A federal judge sentenced environmental lawyer Robert F. Kennedy Jr. to 30 days in jail.
Okay. Stand by.
I'm Dick Russell. I've written 15 books on a wide variety of subjects, ranging from the assassination of President Kennedy to following the gray whale migration all the way from Mexico to Siberia. I've been a writer and an investigative journalist. In the mid-'70s, I became really the first journalist to go out and track down a lot of people who were still alive, who had some knowledge of what had happened, and came to the conclusion that it was not one gunman, Lee Harvey Oswald, acting alone, but there was a domestic conspiracy that basically was a coup d'etat and overthrew President Kennedy that day. So I spent a long time investigating that. I wrote 3 books on the subject, and the country, I feel, has never been the same since. As an environmental writer, which I became in the 1980s, I was very aware of Robert Kennedy Jr. and the fact that he was a very prominent environmental lawyer and as part of the Riverkeeper organization in New York. I lived on the East Coast at the time. So we met for the first time in New York City, and of course, meeting him was like, wow, flashed me back to 1968 when I saw his father speak at my school and University of Kansas. And I remember also a night after I got to know him a little bit where I was sitting there and interviewing him for an article that I was writing about him for a magazine, and the lamplight was such that, and what he was saying was so evocative of his father, I was stunned. He seemed to carry something or embody something of what his father had set out to try to do and had also taught him about when he was growing up. Hickory Hill, where Robert Kennedy grew up most of the time, had originally been owned by his uncle, Jack, and then the Kennedy family moved in when he was still a small boy. It was a country estate, and they had all kinds of animals. They raised, ducks and chickens and horses, and so he grew up, as did his siblings, in this outdoor world with an appreciation for nature, and he fell in love with animals. I mean, he wanted to be a veterinarian, Bobby Jr., when he was a kid, and his father encouraged that. He wasn't encouraged to go into politics. He was going to be a vet. First, Bobby Jr. raised pigeons, and then he had an accident when he was, I think, around 8 years old. He was on a roof of the barn, and he was trying to jump from one part of the barn to another, and he fell and he crashed through a glass window, and he was hurt, cut up pretty bad, and had to go into the hospital for a little while. And as a gift, his father gave him a red-tailed hawk. That was his first bird.
The Hickory Hill was 7 acres surrounded by farm fields. My father and mother kept us outdoors all the time. We weren't allowed to come into the house during daylight hours, so we played outside all day. We had free range to go wander as far as we wanted from the house. We would go up in the woods, sometimes miles from the house. There was kind of a craziness that was going on, the intensity. We had a live sea lion that lived in the pool. A lot of times there were fish heads or on the lawn where he had eaten them. The seal would wander with the dog sometime and leave the property. And on a number of times, people would bring the seal back to us and the dogs. The house was always filled with people, and a lot of them were very well-known people. Supreme Court justices, members of Congress leaders, the Senate, people who were in the cabinet, civil rights leaders. You know, I might come down to breakfast and Andy Williams would be there, the singer, and Tommy Smothers, you know, the Smothers Brothers. Just lots of celebrities around.
Bobby's mother, Ethel, when she and Robert Kennedy were having all these kids, and there were 11 of them, you know, they were inviting all kinds of people over to their home all the time for wild parties in the swimming pool and just crazy adventures, and going out and having adventures on these rivers, these whitewater rafting experiences.
My dad was a great athlete. He had played on what was regarded as the biggest and best football team in the history of Harvard College. My father made the first string, and he would play football with us. He taught us tennis, he taught us football, he taught us to ski, he taught us whitewater kayaking. We did all the major whitewater rivers at a time when people were not doing that. I had a very rich childhood that was filled with all kinds of adventures. It was in the center of what was happening in America at that time, and the big struggles on civil rights, the big struggles about war and peace. Our household was the center of all that.
When JFK was elected president by the narrowest of margins in 1960, he really needed somebody by his side that he could trust. JFK named Robert Kennedy to be Attorney General. And to some that was struck of nepotism, or this is a little bit of a controversial choice, but he was an amazing Attorney General. He was a bulldog. I mean, back in those days, he was pretty justifiably called ruthless. You know, he was going after people quite legitimately that needed to be gone after.
My grandfather had told my uncle that you need to put Bobby in the Justice Department or the CIA, because you want somebody who is very, very close to you and who you trust, because, you know, nobody else is going to have your interests. And so he put my father at the Justice Department, but my father really had a portfolio to run all of the agencies. Everybody knew that when my father spoke, that he was speaking for my uncle. My father had, demonstrated his capacity to run large organizations, to conduct massive investigations, and to be always a very, very loyal and wise advisor to his brother.
As Attorney General, along with his brother, they took on civil rights struggles that were going on in the South, to where there was tremendous opposition from Governor George Wallace in Alabama and from the high officials in Mississippi to enlist James Meredith, the first African American to be admitted to the University of Mississippi. That only happened because Robert Kennedy sent the National Guard there. That was a key element in terms of the civil rights movement that Martin Luther King had forged at the time. He also went after the big gangsters, the organized crime, Sam Giancana, the boss of the Chicago mob, Jimmy Hoffa, the head of the Teamsters Union. There's footage that exists of these amazing hearings that took place where Robert Kennedy is grilling people like Hoffa about their illegal deeds. So the mob hated the Kennedys, and a lot of right-wing extremists in this country who did not want to see integration happen at all costs also hated the Kennedys. They had a lot of enemies.
I remember we would go visit him at the Justice Department, and sometimes we'd go there and have dinner with him, and then we'd drive home with him in the convertible from the Justice Department. I remember one night driving home and him looking up at the Teamsters building, the Marble Palace, and seeing the lights on in the Teamsters in Jimmy Hoffa's office and saying, I have to go back to work after this. He intended to go home. He saw that Jimmy Hoffa was working late, so he felt that he had to be working late.
If it wasn't for the Kennedys, we wouldn't be talking today. His entire Joint Chiefs of Staff, most of them wanted a nuclear confrontation with the Soviet Union. The whole world was teetering on the brink of nuclear Armageddon. And when the Cuban Missile Crisis happened in the fall of 1962, with missiles being installed by the Soviet Union on the shores 90 miles away from the United States off the Florida coast, There was outrage, especially among people like Curtis LeMay in the military, who were hardline, really hardline anti-communists, who felt like, we should go in there and bomb the hell out of them. Well, if we'd have done that, there would have been a nuclear war. People were building fallout shelters in those days. I remember as a kid, having to do duck and cover, go under our desks in grade school, for when the bombs came, we'd be protected, right?
I remember during the Cuban Missile Crisis, U.S. Marshals came to our home and said that they were going to take us to a bomb shelter, which had been built for government officials down in the southern part of Virginia in the Blue Ridge Mountains. And we had heard about it. There was a whole city underground there. So my brother Joe and I were very anxious to actually go down there and see the place. And my dad called us and said that we could not go to that bomb shelter because if we didn't show up at Our Lady of Victory School, that people were going to panic and we needed to be good soldiers and, do our duties. So, I wanted to go.
So JFK set up his own private line of communication to Nikita Khrushchev, the premier of Russia, going around all of these official agencies. And it was a big deal. The red phone to Khrushchev was actually over at Hickory Hill, not in the White House. There were things happening at Hickory Hill, private meetings there, communications between Robert Kennedy and a KGB guy, actually, in Washington, D.C., who's getting secret messages out to Khrushchev to try to head off nuclear confrontation.
A lot of the key decisions during the civil rights crises and during the Bay of Pigs crisis, we watched the decision-making going on in our home. And all of those discussions, or many of them, were taking place in the den. And we could sit behind the couches and listen to them talk about it. There were telephones in every room with multiple lines on them, which I never saw in any other house. But every room had that. The tennis court had telephones with 5 lines on them next to the swimming pool. And then my father also involved us in what was happening. He would write us letters. I have a letter from my dad, for example, one of many, that says, today we federalized the Alabama National Guard and got 6 Negro students into the University of Alabama. I hope that when you get to college age, these kind of problems will be past us. The White House years were very fun years for us. There was crises, etc., but it was exciting. We would go to movies in the White House. We would go swimming in the pool there. We would go to Camp David and go hiking. And we were really a very, very close family. And it provided all of the gravity that oriented our lives.
I have just talked to Father Oscar Hubert of the Holy Trinity Catholic Church. He and another priest tell me that the pair of men have just administered the last rites of the Catholic Church to President Kennedy. President Kennedy has been assassinated. It's official now. The president is dead.
When my uncle died, I was just short of my 10th birthday. And I was at school at that time at Sidwell Friends when my uncle was killed. And I got picked up early from school that day by my mom. And on the way home, we saw people bringing the flags down to half-staff. And I asked her, why are they doing that? And she said that a bad man had shot Uncle Jack. And then when I got home, my dad was actually walking in the yard with John McCone, who is the head of the CIA. And we went over to my dad and hugged him and just stood there for a long time with him, saying nothing. My dad, after his brother's death, was really shattered. He was almost, I would say, dysfunctional for a period of time. He was good with us. He was kind. He was there for us, but he was walking around like a ghost. And I would say that my dad was pretty much a doctrinaire Catholic, and the death of his brother shattered that whole cosmology, and all that doctrine became meaningless to him. And my father began reading widely. He was reorienting his belief system. He found a deeper form of Christianity that was blended with Stoicism, and that allowed him to go on.
After his brother was killed, Robert Kennedy went through a agonizing many months of desolation. He studied the Greeks, he read Camus, the existentialists, he read the Bible too, but it was the Greeks that really resonated with him, and Greek tragedy. Then he came out of it slowly and decided to run for the U.S. Senate. He'd already resigned as Attorney General. He was not popular anyway with Lyndon Johnson. They didn't like each other, and J. Edgar Hoover hated him. So he did. He ran for senator from New York, and he won. Every night around the dinner table, just as his own father had done, Robert Kennedy encouraged them to debate the issues of the day. They talked about Vietnam. They talked about, what about LSD? They talked about these various issues and continued to be very religious. Bobby Jr. and the kids, they went to church on a regular basis. His father also took him out on the Hudson River and the Colorado. They did rafting trips in the Grand Canyon. So these were very impactful for young Bobby as well.
I am announcing today my candidacy for the presidency of the United States. I do not run for the presidency merely to oppose any man, but to propose new policies. I run because I am convinced that this country is on a perilous course, and because I have such strong feelings about what must be done, and I feel that I'm obliged to do all that I can.
My father was against the war, and he had been very outspoken about the war. It would tear his soul out if he supported Johnson at that time. It became a moral crisis for him. He had almost no chance of winning. And yet he decided to run not because he thought he could win, but he decided to run because he thought that sticking on the sidelines and pretending to support Johnson was not an option that would allow him to retain his integrity. So he took a big risk by running. And, it was a very, very exciting campaign. It was this extraordinary wave of enthusiasm about him, and he started winning the primaries. Johnson dropped out.
Robert Kennedy, when he announced he was going to run for president in 1968, came to my school. It was the first place he went. And so I was there in the audience at Allen Fieldhouse, hearing him speak about the Vietnam War and how it had to come to an end, and addressing a lot of things that college students my age were really concerned about, because we were of draft age and perhaps going to have to go off to a war we didn't think was right. So that was pretty amazing to hear him speak then. And then, of course, a couple of months later, he was gone. When he is a young teenager, 14 years old, Bobby is attending a Jesuit school called Georgetown Prep outside of Washington, D.C. It's June 5th, 1968.
My thanks to all of you, and now it's on to Chicago, and let's win there.
Major D reported that Senator Kennedy had been shot.
Would a doctor come right here?
Taken rather coldly by one of the priests at the Georgetown Prep School, who's telling him, there's a car waiting for you downstairs. So that's when he learns that his father has been shot. He's taken aboard Air Force Two with his brother Joe and his sister Kathleen. So it's a deja vu, And he flies out to LA. His father's in the hospital. They remove him from life support that night. Brother Joe comes out and tells the ones who are waiting in the outer room.
Senator Robert Francis Kennedy died at 1:44 a.m. today, June 6, 1968. He was 42 years old.
And I remember Bobby saying the coffin seemed too small to contain him. And you can imagine how devastated he was.
I was not with my dad when he was shot, but I was with him when he died. And then we brought him back to New York, and we waked him at St. Patrick's Cathedral. And we brought him down to Washington, D.C. to Union Station in Washington. It was supposed to be a 2.5-hour train ride, but it ended up being 7.5 hours because there were 2 million people on the train tracks. And it was the entire cross-section of the American public. It was all the crowds that I had seen during the campaigns from when I was a kid, and they were every color of the rainbow, every kind of American. And then we got to Washington, D.C., and President Johnson met us there. And we drove my father up to Arlington, and we buried him under a little stone next to his brother.
He ended up that evening going to his father's office, where he said he could still smell the faint aroma of his cologne from the nights he worked late there. On the wall there were pictures of Joe Jr. and his sister Kathleen, his aunt who was killed in a plane crash. He realized, wow, all those people, they're all dead. And he wept his father's pillow for a while, and when he woke up, his father's close friend Dave Hackett had come into the room and just sat there in silence with him for a long time, and then said he was the best man I ever knew. And Bobby said, that's all I remember. I don't remember anything after that. Shortly after his father's assassination, he was really out of control. I mean, he didn't know what to do. Bobby Kennedy Jr. was really smart, but he was not somebody who liked conventional school that much. He much preferred to be out in the woods after school and training his hawks and being with the animals. So that in itself made things problematic for him. Bobby Jr., he was actually in 3 private schools in 4 years. And he was always basically in trouble there. And that summer in Hyannisport, where the Kennedy family and other wealthy people go, and they go sailing and they go fishing and scuba diving, and it's very idyllic in that sense. And Bobby Jr. is a mess, gets involved as the leader of this quote gang called the Hyannisport Terrors. Had a whole different meaning than what we talk about as terrorism later on. It was pretty innocuous in that way. It was a time in America where there was a lot of youthful rebellion going on, and rebellion took the form of, a couple of kids out there in their hot new car, driving up and down the street, and the mufflers making noise, screaming at each other sometimes. And unlike what would have happened to most any other kid in the United States, suddenly he gets busted for possession of marijuana with his cousin, one of the Shriver kids. And it splashed all over into the New York Times. It's page 1 news. I mean, it's not the next thing. There's a lot of concern. This is it. You've got to toe the line now. No more problematic situations like that. You're going to go on to a new school, and you get kicked out of there. It could look really terrible for you in the future. So he goes off to Pomfret School. That don't you dare let this happen again. Where he went out for football. He thought, well, that'll give him an outlet for his teenage energies. I mean, you have to remember he was 14 when his father was assassinated. So really impressionable, difficult age for anybody. And he was in agony over what had happened, but having a hard time expressing it as a young teenager would. And the football team was mostly all African-American kids. And he became really close to them. He was their buddy, and he used to, ride with them in the back of the bus if that's where they had to sit. He was drawn to them as friends, and one night they were smoking weed there in one of the dorm rooms when the counselor caught him. And rather than implicate them, he said, I took the blame for what had happened, because if I hadn't, we were all going to get expelled from the school. So he was, but they weren't. That says something about him. It says something about loyalty. It shows that just because you were a different color than he was, you were his friend, and that was what counted in this world. So it was quite a gesture, I think, for a young man to make. When I was interviewing him for the biography, he said, I've never told this story, even to my kids. In the summer of 1971, Bobby is at Hyannisport with a girlfriend, and they're going to an ice cream parlor to get some ice cream. And the girl is sitting on the hood of the car, And a policeman comes up to her and accuses her of, what are you doing on that car? She doesn't know why. So Bobby comes out and comes to her defense, just verbally. And the policeman starts giving him a hard time. The policeman claims later that Bobby spit in his face. Well, Bobby said he never did that. But he said, I'm sure I did say some things to him, about the situation. And so they arrest him. And he spends another night in jail. And his mother is very upset about this and tells him, you're ruining the family name. And Bobby then takes off.
I feel like I always had kind of a rebellious nature, and I had a very difficult relationship with my mother at that time. My mother really invented tough love. If I stayed home for a couple of days, I would get in a fight with her, and I would get thrown out of the house. I got my first car when I was 16 years old. I had spent $600 on that car, and I drove the car with some friends across the country. The car died in Santa Barbara, and I had picked up some hitchhikers who were from Mexico, and I sold the car to them. So I had, at that time, I think I had $200.
When Bobby left Hyannisport that summer with a friend of his, he really had nothing. He was pretty much flat broke. He went to Haight-Ashbury in San Francisco and lived there for a little while, and then he started riding the freight trains and having adventures and, near-death experiences in some cases.
The best place to ride when you're on a freight train is in an empty boxcar, and you have to jam something in the door because a lot of them get locked from the outside and you can't get back out. And it could lock you in there potentially for weeks. It's dangerous. And I saw a lot of the country, in ways that other people don't get to see it. A lot of it's tedious because you get stuck on a siding, and it may stay there for an hour, it may stay there for 10 hours, it may stay there for 3 days. And I remember getting stuck in Kansas on a siding, and we ran out of water, and it was about over 100 degrees. It was in the middle of the Great Plains, and I needed to get water so badly. If the engineers knew you were on the train, they would throw you off. I ended up going up to the engine and asking them for water, and they gave it to me. They were very nice, and most of them are really mean, and I've ran into a lot of those. I spent 2 weeks working in a lumber camp up in Pitkin, Colorado, and then rode the trains for the rest of the summer. I still had maybe $20 left from that $200 that I started out with. It was an interesting way of seeing the country.
He's chased by the railroad bulls, and living with hobos. He never tells any of them who he is. He's done with being a Kennedy at that moment in his life. He was just one of the down-and-out people, traveling through this beautiful country, just sitting there with his feet dangling off the side of the freight car and hanging out with these guys and sharing, whatever they cooked up over the campfire at night. Just like, Okies had done in the 30s, heading out, from Oklahoma to California during the Great Dust Bowl years. He was experiencing these things directly, firsthand. He had chosen to do so. Just one of the regular people. And he ended up finally going back to the East Coast and hitchhiked his way, gave his mom a call. When he asked for some money to get there to Martha's Vineyard, she just said, "Get a job." Hung up the phone. After his father's assassination in 1968, it was arranged for all of the Kennedy kids to do something that would give them a sense of meaning and purpose in life, or something they would love to do. So they all went different directions that summer. And Bobby went to Africa with Lem Billings. Now, Lem was a hugely important part of his life. Lem Billings was this incredible person. He was very close to the Kennedy family. I mean, that was really the essence of his life, all the way back to the 1930s when he went to school with Jack Kennedy at Choate, and they became best friends. And then during the White House years, he basically lived in the White House a lot of the time. After Robert Kennedy's assassination, he took Bobby Jr. under his wing. He felt strongly that Bobby was the one who carried something of that political Kennedy spirit, even though he was a teenager and a very troubled teenager at the time.
He became, in essence, a surrogate father to me. But I had a couple of people in my life who really, from when I was very, very young, made me feel loved and made me feel like I was loved unconditionally, and that, people cared about me. And it's occurred to me many times since that that's really what makes children strong. I think it gave me a resilience that allowed me to go through many of these crises that I went through in my life and come out with confidence on the other side.
Lem really felt like, I got to take care of this kid. And he took him to Egypt, he took him to East Africa, where he lived in Kenya. And probably most importantly of all, ultimately, was Lem had a ranch that a relative had in Colombia, in Latin America. So he arranged for Bobby to live on that ranch, which he did for a couple of summers. He was living in these impoverished villages, and he was working. He worked like 10 hours a day for basically the same wages that they were getting, which was nothing. And he came from privilege originally, but he had all kinds of experiences there among these people, learning how to fix fence lines and rein in horses, and it was a deeply meaningful experience to him. In fact, he had a love affair with Latin America that lasted for years. He would go back there later as he grew older and bring 30 people, and they'd have these whitewater rafting excursions in Peru and in Colombia and Venezuela, taking first descents, really, of these uncharted waters where nobody had ever done it before. I mean, it was scary, and there were times when Bobby didn't think he'd make it out alive, or friends of his wouldn't. They all did. They all survived these adventures. So Latin America was a huge part of his life.
I met him in Chile 50 years ago this summer in July. He was a 19-year-old kid. I was there reporting for the Village Voice on Allende, but I decided to take a few days off to go skiing. And we met, and he said, I heard that we can go up to this Christ of the Andes. And I said, that sounds like a lot of fun. There's a statue on the border between Chile and Argentina. We just decided, we got together, about 6 of us went up there. So we put on seal skins and we started marching up the mountains, the Andes, which is the second highest range in the world after the Himalayas. We had gotten about 3/4 of the way up to the summit, and we heard some popping, and it was bullets ricocheting off rocks up there. We suddenly realized what was happening. We all dove down in the snow, this bottomless powder, and we heard these bullets spraying all around us. We couldn't figure out what was happening. I mean, why are people shooting at us? There was a bunch of basically army thugs of Pinochet, who was starting his revolution at that point against the democratically elected President Salvador Allende, and they were afraid that we were stealing a lot of money or drugs outside the country. Finally, we were down the snow, we're yelling at each other, what's going on, 20 minutes. And so somebody said, do you have a white handkerchief? And Bobby said, give it to me, I'll put it on top of my ski pole and wave it around and hope nobody shoots. So he did, and he took the ski pole and waved it around, and generally we couldn't hear anybody. He couldn't tell that they weren't gonna just machine gun him right away. And he seemed to say, it's all right, guys, they seem to be putting down their guns. We skied down to them and, holding our arms up in the air to show that we had no weapons. We talked to the soldiers and they said, yeah, that's what we were doing. We were gonna free Chile from these socialists and Marxists, and we thought you guys were bad guys. But Bobby was the only one who would show himself. I was quite amazed at that. So we became foxhole friends.
He's gotten out of high school, and like his father before him and his uncle, he goes on to Harvard, studying a lot of science. He's fascinated by science and literature. Then he decides he does want to become a lawyer, and he goes to the University of Virginia Law School, which is also where his father had gotten his law degree. And he there meets a young lady named Emily Black, who he falls in love with. And he described her as, she was just really smart and really funny and quite attractive. And she's an Indiana girl, a Midwesterner. So they have this big wedding in 1983 in Bloomington, Indiana. And simultaneously with all this, he's still suffering the terrible agony internally that came with his father's death. And he's become an addict.
By the time I was 15 years old, I hadn't even tasted coffee. In the summer of 1969, LSD had come to the Cape that night for the first time, and an older boy I knew offered me LSD, and so I took it. I had this, extraordinary, very powerful dose of LSD, and I had very, very vivid hallucinations. And in the morning, I was walking back home, and I was very remorseful. I was saying to myself, I shouldn't have done that, and, I'm never going to do that again. And I saw these older boys in the woods just before I got home, and I said that I was crashing, and that I was, feeling bad, feeling dark. And they said, try some of this. And it was a line of crystal meth. And I snorted it, I felt great. And that story became the template of my addiction over the next 14 years, of me telling myself again and again, I'm not going to do that, and then doing it. And to me, the most demoralizing part was my incapacity to keep contracts with myself, to say to myself, I'm not going to do that, and then to stick to that. And I had iron willpower in every other part of my life.
He has talked about this more freely in recent years. He became addicted to heroin. He spent a lot of times going into Harlem, dangerous territory, to score drugs. Went through a very tough period with that, but at the same time he was very high functioning. So he kept it under wraps.
I'd say he's done all right. Bobby Kennedy Jr., son of a New York senator, has starred in a television documentary that was on Kenya, graduated from Harvard University, and has just had his first book published. The book's title is Judge Frank M. Johnson Jr., Biography.
Altogether, he was an addict for 14 years before, on an airplane heading for South Dakota in 1983, he had a near-fatal overdose and went into rehab after that.
The family whose tragedies our country has followed and indeed felt has been struck once again. Today, David Kennedy, found dead in a Palm Beach, Florida hotel room. Although Kennedy had a history of drug abuse, police would not positively confirm that caused his death. They would say only there was no sign of foul play. That's a habit David shared with his older brother Robert, who's now on probation after a recent heroin possession conviction. It's also a problem the family tried to deal with by hiring private live-in drug counselors, though in this case, to no avail. Today, a phone call by the mother of Robert Kennedy's 11 children prompted the search of her son's hotel room. This morning, in that room just after 11:30, David Kennedy was pronounced dead. Ironically, it was also in a hotel room back in 1968 that David Kennedy learned from a television news crew of the death of his father. In Miami, Diane Magnum, Channel 10, Eyewitness News.
I was actually on my way to a rehab, but I wanted to go to detox first before I went in because I didn't want to detox in front of people. So I was flying to South Dakota. I was going to go detox myself in a cabin. Then I got arrested. I stopped on my way to the airport and bought some drugs in Harlem and East Harlem and overdosed on the airplane. And I was arrested when I landed. And I got national headlines. And it was a nightmare, but it was the beginning of my recovery because there was no longer any obstacle to me talking honestly about my addiction. Everybody already knew.
It was a huge turning point in his life. And this began a good 6 months in a New Jersey facility for rehab. He began reading the Bible again, the lives of the saints, which interested him greatly because so many of them had gone through periods of addiction and alcohol and had come out the other side to become St. Augustine or wherever it was, right? St. Francis. So he identified with the fact that this could happen. And then he discovered the psychologist, Carl Jung, and just happened upon a book there one day in rehab called Synchronicity. In the book, Jung writes of a patient he had We had a powerful dream about a scarab beetle that showed up in the dream. And where Jung lived in Switzerland, you never saw scarab beetles. Suddenly, there was a tapping on the window of Jung's office, and in flew a scarab beetle. It landed in the palm of Jung's hand, and he presented it to the lady. And this story really knocked Bobby out.
And around that time, I stumbled on a book called Synchronicity. Somebody left it on a table. It was synchronicity that I found in that book. Synchronicity means a coincidence, essentially. Carl Jung, he had those kind of events happening all the time, and what he thought of them as kind of a way that God was breaking his own rules, the natural laws, the laws of mathematics, the laws of physics, the laws of biology, the laws of chance, and that he was reaching in to touch us on the shoulder at key moments in our lives to say, I'm here, I'm watching you. I knew when I went into the rehab, I knew that I needed to have a spiritual awakening because I didn't want to be the person who I was. I didn't want to be out there white-knuckling it. I wanted to be the kind of person who woke up every morning and never thought about drugs, never thought about getting high, who just kissed their wives, took care of their children, went to work, and just was normal. So I was ready to do anything that I had to do to improve my chances of escaping from addiction and ending this compulsion. And I started arranging my life in a way that broke down every decision I made during the day and induced in it a moral dimension.
Please help me welcome our host, Joe Polish, and Robert F. Kennedy, Jr.
Tell me something that nobody in the world understands about you.
As you know, one of the things they say in recovery is that you're as sick as your secrets.
Yep.
I knew from the beginning that, if you're an addict, you are dishonest. I think it's impossible to be a drug addict and not lie. And I knew that the dishonesty was associated with my addiction, and that if I did not become rigorously honest in every aspect of my life, that I was going to fall back into the addiction. And that's the only thing I can control. And I can get up every day and say, reporting for duty, sir, and then go forward and try to keep doing the next right thing, to make my bed, to put the water in the ice tray before I put it in the freezer, to put the shopping cart back where the shopping cart is supposed to go. And as long as I do that, I can be peaceful.
To this day, he goes to AA meetings. Even if he's on the road, he'll find, wherever they're having them, a community center, a church, and he'll go there and meet new people and find out what their problems are and talk to them. And even if you don't want to do it, he said, how long do I have to do this? Well, you do it till you like it. He said, I still don't like it, but I do it because I have to in order to, make sure that I stay straight and can help other people get through these kinds of problems that they have. In a world we live in today where the opioid crisis is epidemic and so many thousands of kids are dying of fentanyl overdoses, who better to address that than somebody who's been there, who's been to the bottom of those kinds of situations himself and had to realize that there is a higher purpose to life and a meaning to life, and I'm going to fight for that and do whatever I can to get there. Coming out of rehab, he had to do community service, and an opportunity arose where there was an organization in New York on the Hudson River called Riverkeeper. The mission of the Riverkeepers was to do something about the terrible pollution that was impacting the Hudson River. Because the Hudson at the time was one of the most polluted waters in the world. And Bobby Kennedy Jr. knew this from having been out there, with his father, who was very disturbed about this. You could not swim in the river because it was so polluted, People couldn't eat the fish because they were contaminated. Polychlorinated biphenyls are this very toxic compound that was being dumped into the Hudson River by these big corporations. They were violating the Clean Water Act, landmark legislation that had been passed in the early 1970s that demanded that you take measures to mitigate and make sure that you weren't just pouring your toxic wastes and chemicals into the waterway. What Bobby did was study the laws to make sure that the laws were being followed, and in most cases they were not. And in fact, what he also discovered at the same time was that there was collusion between the Department of Environmental Protection, supposed to be protecting people from these big corporations, who were basically being bought and paid for by these companies. Gradually, he got to know a guy named John Cronin, who was already out there on the water making waves against these big polluters, like ExxonMobil and Monsanto, which were dumping PCBs into the river. And Bobby and he hit it off right away and became partners in this riverkeeper venture. And Bobby became the guy who, because he now had his law degree, was taking on these corporations, large and small, and they went to war on this. First of all, doing their homework, getting out there on the river, going into the pipes that were pouring this stuff into the waterway and seeing what was in there and measuring it scientifically. Now they began mounting lawsuits.
And so when I got sober, I wanted to be true to myself. And I knew that I wanted to work in the outdoors and I wanted to protect nature. When my dad died when I was 14 years old, I felt something of an obligation to kind of pick up the torch and follow his footsteps. And, so I ended up going to the same college he went to and the same law school he went to. And then I went into the DA's office. But it was something disjointed about that experience. It wasn't authentic for me. It was something that I was doing out of a sense of obligation that, in retrospect, my father wouldn't have wanted to happen. He wanted us all to take our own paths. So I went back to law school at night at Pace University, which was a newer law school that was specializing in environmental law, and it was perfect for me. It was a few minutes from my home. I ended up staying 2 years at night school and getting the first master's degree in environmental law. Riverkeeper was founded initially in 1966 by a blue-collar coalition of commercial and recreational fishermen. And John hired me as the first full-time attorney of that organization. I went to work for them, as a volunteer. And while I was volunteering for them, I was walking creek beds looking for polluters. I found 26 polluters on one creek in Newburgh, New York, Quassia Creek, and we sued every one of them on the same day and did a big press conference. And that was the beginning of my litigation career.
I get a call from Bobby, and he calls me up and he said, I found a provision of the Clean Water Act that is not being implemented. And the power industry swung into action, and they basically got it shut down. And he said, will you sue the EPA to promulgate regulations implementing this section of the Clean Water Act? And I looked at it, and sure enough, Section 316B, cooling water intake structures, mandated that the EPA promulgate regulations governing the location, design, and construction of cooling water intake structures, which were principally at power plants, because they would put these big pipes out that would suck up water from the rivers and run them once through to cool their operations, and then spit out superheated water on the other end, which was destabilizing. It was sucking fish in, killing fish, and then creating a superheated environment on the other end. It was hurting the environment.
It started off in a little town called Newburgh. They found people willing to come forward and be whistleblowers about this, and they began winning cases. And Bobby connected up during this period with the Pace University Law School, right in the same area of the Hudson, and formed what's called an environmental litigation clinic. So Bobby had all these students who were learning environmental law and was able to convince the courts to allow the students to actually come in and argue cases. So they could take on a lot more cases through Pace University than they had before.
And I remember the industry came forward in an attempt to intervene, saying this is going to have a $3 billion impact on our industry. And we defeated that. So it was a $3 billion case, and Bobby was responsible from the inception to all the way to the Supreme Court. And the net effect was preventing some of these coal-fired plants from being built and causing others to be shut down, about 20 of them, I believe.
Riverkeeper became a hugely important factor in the cleanup of the Hudson River, which today is one of the cleanest waterways in the country, largely because of what they were doing in the 80s and 90s there.
Ultimately, we brought over 500 lawsuits against Hudson River polluters. We forced polluters on the river to spend over $5.5 billion in remediating the Hudson. And today, as a result of our work and the work of many other people, the Hudson is an international model for ecosystem protection. It's the richest waterway in the North Atlantic. And this was water that was dead water for 20-mile stretches north of New York City, south of Albany in 1966. It caught fire, it turned colors depending on what color they were painting the trucks at the GM plant in Tarrytown. Today, it's the richest waterway in the North Atlantic. It produces more pounds of fish per acre, more biomass per gallon than any other waterway in the Atlantic Ocean north of the equator. It's the last major river system left that still has strong spawning stocks of all of its historical species of migratory fish. And the miraculous resurrection of the Hudson inspired the creation of water keepers and river keepers all over, not only our country, but the world.
It's a beautiful fish. And you know, it's great to be able to find fish like this, even carp and herring. This is a herring run now in a creek that a few years ago was completely dead. You know, we found it really a polluted cesspool when we came here in 1985. But now it seems pretty clean, and you know, there's a relative abundance of fish in it.
So as a lawyer with the Natural Resources Defense Council, Bobby became part of an international environmental program. So there was a situation that occurred also in the early 1990s around this same time, where a huge utility called Hydro-Quebec wanted to build these massive dams in a region of Canada where it would have wiped out a number of native villages. One phase of this project had already gone through. It was called the James Bay Project, where the idea of the Quebecian leadership was that they were going to sell this hydropower being generated to the United States. In fact, New York had signed an agreement, a $5 billion contract initially, to accept this hydropower that would be coming, you know, through a series of pipes and so on, down to New York State.
So Hydro-Quebec is one of the biggest dam builders in the world, and they were expanding into northern Quebec. These were the traditional Cree territories, and these rivers were basically dislocating communities, and they were doing it without really much compensation or consultation at the time. There was this idea back then that this was for the good of everyone.
So in this case, the people were known as the Cree. They'd been around for centuries, living on the same land, and all of a sudden it was all being taken away from them, and mercury pollution was happening in their rivers that was astounding to see. The caribou were dying by the droves, and at the same time the largest, most cheapest, abundant energy source in North America was looming on the horizon for New Yorkers. If the community had been, you know, some lovely upper middle class area of this country, of course the people would have said, oh, we don't want this here, and it wouldn't have happened. But they were expendable. You know, nobody knew much about the Cree, and there were 12,000 of them, and they were, you know, brown people, and it could go ahead.
The campaign that the Crees have had in the States and in Europe, all over the world, maybe they were successful at it, but are they Quebecers or not? They live in our territory, they live with us, and they're penalizing Quebecers for that. And that's what I cannot accept, and I will never accept. Their territory that they claim is theirs is still ours. We haven't given it up yet.
About the lack of fundamental procedural rights?
Yeah, about the lack of fundamental procedural rights. It's important that people know that this is a reenactment of what's been happening to Indian people since the beginning of time. And that's the picture that we want to draw. It's because people are outraged by that. And it's exactly what's happening here
It's just wearing a different cloak, you know, and that's why people get emotional about this, because it's the same thing that's been happening for 500 years. It's the same thing that happened in the Black Hills and everywhere else. It's just done with all this cloak of legality, and what we're doing is we're tearing apart the legality and we're going back and showing that this is a metaphor that's for what's been happening to the Indians since the beginning of time.
So one of the tribal leaders named Matthew Kuncombe led an expedition by canoe to New York, which is where Bobby met him and came to be aware of the problem. And Matthew Kuncombe was amazing. He was a brilliant activist, willing to fight for the rights of his people. And Bobby joined him. And then Bobby had political clout. Bobby first buttonholed Governor Mario Cuomo at a reception at one time and said, you know, told him what was going on. Eventually, there was a state assemblyman from New York, a man named Eric Hoyt, who went up there on one of these river expeditions, came back, and he was outraged at what he saw and the disease he saw in these native villages. And he was trying to get a bill through the New York State Assembly to cut off this deal that New York had for the hydropower with the Hydro-Quebec utility, when he collapsed of a heart attack and died on the floor of the Senate. Well, it was a terrible thing to happen, but it also resulted in the legislature going along with what he had wanted to do. Governor Cuomo stopped the project. So Hydro-Quebec had to come up with something else.
It became economically impossible for some of these power companies to raise the investment to build new power plants. And so it changed the world. It encouraged these people at these power companies to rethink their long-term plans, because they knew that if they were going to continue to build plants that destroyed the environment, they were going to have to pay a cost in fighting this fight. So what they did is they started saying, look, we need to look for the cleanest technology so that we can be in the most defensible position. So he forced change and innovation in a very positive way, and ironically may have helped the power industry become more competitive.
It wasn't just in New York with the Hudson River Keeper that Bobby began fighting for clean waterways. North Carolina, very important story. And in North Carolina, there was a guy who was a commercial fisherman on the Neuse River named Rick Dove. He was an ex-Marine, and suddenly his fish were dying. It was a parasite that got into the fish and killed 1 billion fish on that river. And the big problem turned out to be this industrial hog farm situation. Smithfield Foods was a new conglomerate that sprung up. They had the slaughterhouse, they had the whole wazoo, right? And they were pouring all of this untreated hog waste into the river. The sewage waste, the fecal waste from 10,000 hogs was equivalent to the human fecal waste of 100,000 people. I mean, you know, it's a lot of manure going into the waterways and affecting the fish.
I was working for Bobby Kennedy, and he wanted someone to focus exclusively on pollution from industrial agricultural operations. And so big feedlots that were causing water pollution. And Bobby said, you need to go and visit these communities and see the impacts that it's having on the people and on the animals and on the environment. It was very eye-opening. Pollution from the hog industry is mostly about the manure, and that waste is not treated, and it's kept in open-air pits and is essentially vulnerable to spilling into the environment directly without any kind of treatment. It was also leaking into groundwater and into people's drinking water directly. So it was reaching the waters that people swim in and fish in and drink from. And I met with people who had been living in the same house, sometimes for generations, and these huge hog operations would move in nearby. They couldn't sit on their porches anymore because the hog manure odor would come in like a fog sometimes, and it was so bad sometimes it would make people throw up.
And Smithfield moved a slaughterhouse into North Carolina that could process 30,000 hogs a day. its model was based upon its capacity to escape the laws that say you have to treat waste before you dump it into the environment. And they began poisoning whole sections of North Carolina. But the industry should have had to build sewage treatment plants, but they weren't required to, because they had political clout that allowed them to escape the discipline of the law.
Is, in fact, Murphy Family Farms the largest hog-producing facility?
I don't know. We don't make any claim to that. We read that sometimes in the magazines. I don't know whether that's true or not. It's totally irrelevant to us whether we're the largest or not. We just want to make sure we're the most profitable.
Murphy backed legislation that benefited his business. The bills have become known as Murphy's Laws.
And Smithfield's partner, Wendell Murphy, who was a state legislature, had looked at what happened in the chicken industry, where three guys, Frank Perdue, Bo Pilgrim, and John Tyson, invented a new way of raising chicken in little battery cages where the birds literally cannot stand up, and in some cases they can't turn around. They'll stack 1 million of those in giant warehouses and then dose them with subtherapeutic antibiotics and hormones that cause them to literally lay their guts out during a short, miserable life. And in doing that, they had put 1 million independent chicken farmers out of business, and they had made themselves billionaires. And Wendell Murphy said, I can do the same thing with hogs. And he invented a new kind of farm, which is just a factory. It's a meat factory. And they dropped the price of hogs from 60 cents a pound to 2 cents a pound. So they put out of business 28,000 hog farmers virtually overnight in North Carolina, and they replaced them with 2,800 factories, each one of them either owned or operated or contracted to Smithfield. And then they spread like a virus to the rest of hog production all across our country. And the whole time we were litigating against them every step of the way. We sued Smithfield, I'm sure, more than any other entity on the planet.
We made the decision to pursue the legal violations that Smithfield was routinely practicing throughout the state that were causing pollution, were polluting people's water. We knew that those things violated the Clean Water Act, what they were doing every day on a daily basis. We were fortunate a judge agreed with us completely that there were really serious allegations and that they were responsible under those laws. And so this case made it very clear that every citizen in America, they could sue under the Clean Water Act and Clean Air Act if they were negatively affected. So everybody who worked for him worked incredibly hard because you had to, because that was expected of you, and that's what he was doing. He wasn't expecting anything of us that he wasn't doing himself. What Bobby had been saying to me was he wanted to work to give voice to the people that had rights that were not being respected. And even in caring about how the animals were living, it was this sense of the powerlessness of the people or the animals that were affected by these big industrial operations.
So eventually then they went to court, took on Smithfield Foods that way, and were quite successful. It took a while, but eventually the EPA did set a zero discharge standard in the year 2000 that clamped down on the hog farm industry in the United States. At the same time, Smithfield Foods eventually had to pay close to $1 billion to landowners who had complained about toxic odors that were permeating their areas. So it ended well. Companies won't pay nearly as much attention to where they dump their waste as they will $1 billion fines.
If we want to measure the economy, and this is how we ought to be measuring it, based upon how it produces jobs and the dignity of jobs over the generations and how it preserves the value of the assets of our community. If, on the other hand, we want to do what the big polluters often want us to do, which is to treat the planet as if it were a business in liquidation, convert our natural resources to cash as quickly as possible, have a few years of pollution-based prosperity, We can generate an instantaneous cash flow and the illusion of a prosperous economy, but our children are going to pay for our joyride. And they're going to pay for it with denuded landscapes, poor health, huge cleanup costs. We don't have to choose between good environmental policy and good economic policy. In 100% of the cases, good economic policy is identical to good environmental policy.
But he really kept working at it. I mean, he just kept going and building these groups and working with these groups and pounding it over and over and over again. The clean water means strong communities. And he said, you know, I'm starting the Waterkeeper Alliance. In 1999, he put together a collection of other groups. I think it was San Francisco Bay Keeper, Long Island Sound Keeper, Hudson River Keeper, Delaware River Keeper. And he got them together and they formed the Waterkeeper Alliance. And so a year later, as he was recruiting, he wanted to know if we wanted to be involved. Ultimately, we joined a year later as the Lake Ontario Waterkeeper.
Waterkeeper now has 350 programs that it licenses. Each one has a patrol boat, and we have somebody out there suing polluters. And we now spread to 46 countries, and it's the biggest water protection group in the world. And you know, it was a vision of Bob Boyle, John Cronin, and then hard work by a lot of people.
And what really made the Waterkeeper Alliance work as a sort of an alliance was that they had someone who showed up. And no one ever believed he'd show up at some of the events I was putting on. And I remember once he was very sick. His wife Mary called me and said, you know, he's not going to make it. He's in the hospital. And I was like, oh my God, if he doesn't show up, right? So I just assumed he wouldn't. Got a call. He got on the plane that morning. He came. He still had the blood from where he had pulled out the, you know, the intravenous in his arms, the stains on his shirts. And he showed up, worked. He did it all. And I put him on the plane the next morning, and I know we went back, and he was dehydrated. But I just couldn't believe that he knew how important it was to us that he had to show up.
This is a big old eel.
It's a big eel. These things are hard to pick up.
I have always seen Bobby act honorably in every situation, and he's not a guy who sits around. And you know, he cared about the environment, and he cared about making the environment available in the way it was to him to future generations. That's the other thing that Bobby taught me about, was just the importance of the environment to spiritual well-being and to society.
We're not protecting nature for nature's sake, but because we believe our lives are going to be richer and our communities are going to be richer and our children's lives are going to be richer. And where our children can go to the banks and see the fishermen doing what they've been doing for generations and understand that they're part of something that's larger than themselves, that they're part of a continuum. I don't want my children growing up in a world where we've lost touch with the seasons and the tides and the things that connect us to 10,000 generations of human beings that were here before laptops and that connect us ultimately to God. And for me, therefore, destroying these things is the moral equivalent of tearing the last pages out of the last Bible or Torah or Talmud or Koran on earth. What we're doing here is recognizing we have a debt to our children, and we have a debt to the people in our society who don't speak loudly. And that is a recognition that we live in a community, and being part of a community is painful because you can't just make decisions based upon your own self-interest. You have to account for the costs and impacts of those decisions on other people. And that's really what environmentalism is about. It's about recognizing that debt to others.
In 2003, FDA and the National Academy of Sciences published the result of a study that showed that every freshwater fish in America had dangerous levels of mercury in its flesh. And it struck me then that we were living in a kind of science fiction nightmare. And I was going around our country in the province of Canada doing lectures at big forums, thousands of people, about mercury contamination. I started noticing that these women started showing up at my speeches, and they were mothers, and they'd sit in the front seat. They would come early, and they would then stay late. And it turned out that all of them were the mothers of intellectually disabled children who believed that vaccines had caused their children's injuries. I would listen to these moms, and they were very eloquent, they're articulate, and I did a little research and showed that, learned that the public health agencies were saying this isn't true. But I also had the experience on the Hudson where fishermen would know things that the environmental agencies didn't. And many, many times, and it was always the fishermen who were right. They saw what was happening in the river. My inclination is, how would all these mothers make the exact same observation? I didn't have it in me to just dismiss them. Somebody should be listening to them. I just didn't want it to be me, because I had other plans for my life.
Okay, can you stand up? Come on, have to. I had no plan to be on this path to advocacy. In fact, if you could pick someone who's the least likely in terms of openness to exploring issues with vaccines, I would have fallen in that camp. So I am the mother of 4 children. My first child was a daughter, and she was also fully vaccinated, and as far as we could tell, no issues arose. When I had my son, I was doing my PhD in neuropsychology. I was working full-time in a med school, and I was as pro every vaccine and science as a person could be. And I took my second child in, my first son, and he had 8 vaccines. And we brought him home. He was 4 months old. And as we came out, everything was fine. But about 12 hours later, he just had a severe reaction, which we later learned from the neurologist at the hospital was a brain infection caused by his pertussis vaccine. And that was the start of the path. Porter is still severely developmentally delayed, doesn't have receptive language, so can't answer questions, has intractable seizures many a week. We had no clue how severe this path was going to be. So there's something called the National Vaccine Compensation Program. This started in 1986, and it came after many multi-million-dollar lawsuits against Big Pharma for vaccine reactions. Pharma goes to Congress saying, you want us to create these vaccines for public good, and we're just getting sued like crazy. It's not working. They ended up figuring out a kind of a compromise system. Pharma has no liability for their product, still doesn't. And what they would do is charge a small surcharge on every vaccine, you and me, pay for the vaccine compensation program that would be created and maintained for children and adults that are injured or killed by mandated vaccines. And we were pursuing a claim in the vaccine compensation program. If you have something called a table injury, literally on a table of injuries, and you can prove that and that it's not caused by something else, it's meant to be what they call swift justice. Well, our swift justice took 8 years and was just agonizing trying to get through it. We did get through it. Porter did win his case. And from there, just started digging in, doing research, understanding the scope of this problem, other people involved, and got more involved in activism at that point. What then happened was I became aware of the work that Bobby Kennedy was doing. And so I went out to Hyannis Fort, which is where his family has a vacation house. And I showed up on his porch when he was out there vacationing. I had a whole slew of women who helped me in gathering a ton of scientific data to bring him. I literally brought a banker's box of articles. I knocked on the door, I asked for Bobby, and he came out. And I told him who I was and what I was doing and that I wanted to talk to him. And he said, I don't want to get involved in the vaccine issue. He was not just a no, he was a hard no. He was not interested. And he tried to cut in, and I just kept going. And I told him about my son and the vaccine cord and the brain injury. And I paused and I said, what do you think? And he said, I need to go sailing. And he left and he went sailing. And he was gone for hours. It must have been quite a sail. And I waited. There was a little chair on his front porch, and I waited. And he came back and he said, "You're still here." And then he looked at me and he said, "You're not going to leave, are you?" And I said, "I will leave, but I need you to read these. I just need you to even read some of these." And he said, "Come back tomorrow."
Sarah Bridges came to my house in the summer of 2005, and she's like all these other women. She's very presentable, and smart. She's a psychologist. She had a son, Porter, who she felt had gotten autism from the vaccine. Not only did she feel that, but the vaccine court acknowledged her claim and gave her a $20 million award. I'm used to reading science, and my job is about reading and deconstructing science. This is what I do. I've had hundreds and hundreds of lawsuits. Almost all of them involve scientific controversies. So all of them involve scientists who are saying one thing on one side and scientists who are looking at the same data and saying a completely different thing. And, my job is to discredit the ones who are not telling the truth. I started reading these studies. I was reading just the abstract, not the whole study, but there's a summary at the beginning of every scientific study called the abstract that summarizes the key points. And I started reading the abstracts. And before I was 3 inches down on that pile, I was saying, holy cow, this is real science, and it's saying that it's confirming what these women have been saying to me.
So he sat up and he read most of this through the night. And I came back the next day and said, what do you think about it? And he said, something's wrong. I'm going to make some calls.
I talked to Francis Collins. I talked to Marie McCormick, who was the head of the Institute of Medicine, the National Academy of Sciences, and another doctor, Kathleen Stratton, who was the chief staffer there. And I started saying to her, here's what I'm reading in these studies, and can you make sense of this to me? And my presumption is there was an explanation. And they couldn't answer my questions. All 3 of those people said to me, you should talk to Paul Offit. Paul Offit is an industry insider. He's a vaccine developer. He's a business partner with Merck. And I caught him in a lie. He cited a study by a CDC scientist called Picciero, and I had read that I knew was not true. And Picciero gave tuna fish sandwiches to one group of people, kids, and then he gave the vaccines to the other. And the mercury in the vaccines was a different kind of mercury. It's called ethyl mercury. And it had disappeared from their blood within a week. Whereas the methyl mercury from tuna fish was still in their blood 64 days later. Picciero said, okay, well, mercury is safe in vaccines because it's excreted by the body. But immediately when he wrote that, a bunch of scientists, including a very famous toxicologist called Boyd Haley, who's the world's authority on mercury contamination, had written letters to the journal saying, well, what happened to the mercury? Because Picciero couldn't find it in the children's feces or their sweat or their urine or their hair or their fingernails. And then so NIH had then commissioned a study by a guy called Thomas Burbacker, which I'd also read by this time. And Burbacker did the same experiment, but on monkeys. And what he found out is the mercury does leave the blood very fast, but it's leaving the blood because it crosses the blood-brain barrier much easier than methyl mercury. And it was going into their brains, and it was staying there. And it was metabolizing into the most toxic form of mercury, which is called organic mercury. And it was just sitting in their brain. We now know, from subsequent experiences that 27 years later, it's still there. And Offit cited the Picciero study to tell me that mercury is excreted immediately, and everybody knew that Burbacker had debunked that study. And I said to him, what about the Burbacker study? And there was dead silence on the phone, and that was the moment that he knew and I knew that he was lying, and we both knew that I knew that he was lying. He said, well, you're right. It's not the Picciero study. It doesn't really tell us anything, but it's a whole mosaic of studies. That was the phrase he used. And I said, can you cite one for me? And he said, I'll get back to you. And he never called back.
And so we had one iconic trip to the New York Times. He wanted to write an op-ed about what he had learned about heavy metals and vaccine safety issues. And so we went. He brought Dr. Boyd Haley with us to talk about the science. Bobby was talking about the science. And I went as a representative of a parent who went through the vaccine program. We went in there, and the New York Times was overflowing with people wanting to be part of this. We had editors, we had copywriters, interns, friends of interns, literally people sitting on each other's laps. We talked. I presented about going through the vaccine court, the government acknowledging my son has autism. Dr. Haley talked about the science. Bobby talked about the science and brought more references than you can believe. Got through all of this, and the head editor looked at Bobby and said, can't do it. The CDC says vaccines are safe. And it was obvious. It didn't matter what we said. It didn't matter what data we brought. There was not going to be an op-ed. Coming out of the New York Times, just being dismissed by them, he turned and he said, I think they like me. And then he said on a serious tone, we'll go somewhere else. What I didn't know when I met him was that he has a tenacity unlike any person I've met before. And it's a tenacity even in the face of social disapproval. If he feels it's the right thing to do, even if it's not popular, he's going to do it.
Soon after that, this nurse practitioner who was very famous, she testified before Congress 6 times. She was a public health official in Georgia, advisor to the Pentagon. She was an advisor to NIH, universally respected, revered. She came to me with a transcript of a secret meeting with, I think, 52 vaccine industry officials from all the regulatory agencies, FDA, CDC, NIH, the European Medical Association, the WHO. They all had a secret meeting in a off-CDC campus because they didn't want it to be subject to Freedom of Information requests. And they had convened this meeting because all these mothers who were complaining to CDC that my kid got poisoned by a vaccine and got autism, they actually did a study and they used the biggest database in the country called the Vaccine Safety Data Link, which is it's the vaccination records from the top 10 HMOs from millions of clients. They looked at the hepatitis B vaccine given during the first 30 days, and they'd compare that to kids who got it later or didn't get it at all. That vaccine, which is loaded with mercury. And what they found is kids who got it during the first 30 days had an 1,135% greater chance of getting a later autism diagnosis. And they knew right then what was causing the autism epidemic. Autism had gone from 1 in 10,000 in my generation, and it still is, in 69-year-old men, to 1 in 34 in my kids' generation. And all these mothers were saying, it's the vaccine. And Sarah Bridges was one of them. And the vaccine court agreed until it became prohibited to acknowledge that. So they knew. And I don't know how it happened, but somebody had transcribed that meeting. And I published them in Rolling Stone magazine and in Salon simultaneously. And then Salon withdrew it 6 years later, withdrew the article, and then Rolling Stone finally, 16 years later during the pandemic, when Rolling Stone was taken over by pharmaceutical people, they also withdrew it. And that was the beginning of my battle with the pharmaceutical industry.
Any headline about Robert Kennedy says anti-vaxxer Kennedy, blah, blah, blah. Or conspiracy theorist is always in the first couple of paragraphs. Many of the things he's talking about are not theories. We are in a crisis. We're in a public health crisis where 54% of the country now has chronic disease. He's described as an anti-vaxxer when he's really not. His kids have been vaccinated. He certainly got vaccinated himself. He feels we've got to have safe vaccines that are tested against a placebo in clinical trials. He's confronted Dr. Fauci with that in the past, asked to see studies if they've been done about this. Nobody's ever shown him a study. Think about the fact that today in our country, 1 in 34 kids are diagnosed with autism. Now, I'm not saying that comes from vaccines. Maybe some of it does. Maybe some of it comes from glyphosate, which also Bobby Kennedy's been fighting to get out of our environment by going up against the Monsanto chemical company that makes it. The other factor that's so big in this, besides self-interest, is fear. We're in a situation in this country where, thanks largely to the COVID pandemic, people are very afraid. And certainly many people are afraid of him because of what he represents. He is a threat to the status quo. He is a threat to the merger between corporate and state power. He's doing it for the sake of the country, the way he sees it, and he's following his heart.
We'll now go with opening testimony. Mr. Kennedy, you are recognized for your opening statement.
Excuse me, point of order. I know that witnesses usually have 5 minutes. I see 10 minutes on board. Is it going to be 10 minutes
We'll
for
give him
every
5
witness?
minutes, but we're pretty lax with this. We'll let him go for
We are?
a little, yeah.
Okay,
And-
okay.
but
Let's just watch the time.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Chairman, maybe we could put 5 minutes on the clock then, not 10.
And if you want to cut him off and censor him some more, you're welcome to do it.
Oh, that's not my job. That's your job. Why don't you threaten a witness?
These are defamations and malignancies that are used to censor me, to prevent people from listening to the actual things that I'm saying. My whole Instagram account with 900,000 people was taken down. There was no misinformation on my Instagram account. Everything I put on that account was cited and sourced. The peer-reviewed publications or government databases. Nobody has ever pointed to a single piece of misinformation that I publish. So now I'm subject to this new form of censorship, which is called targeted propaganda, where people apply pejoratives like anti-vax. I've never been anti-vaccine, but everybody in this room probably believes that I have been. Anti-Semitism, racism. These are the most appalling, disgusting pejoratives, and they're applied to me to silence me. And by the way, I want to say this while I'm on the record. In my entire life, I have never uttered a phrase that was either racist or anti-Semitic. All the things that I'm accused of right now by you. And in this letter are distortions, they're misrepresentations. I didn't say those things. I have never been anti-vax. All my children are vaxxed. I'm fully compliant with the vaccine schedule myself, except for COVID. I have never told the public avoid vaccination. I believe vaccines should be tested with the same rigor as other medicines and medications. I spent 30 years trying to get mercury out of the fish in this country, and nobody ever called me anti-fish. We were trying to get mercury out of vaccines because mothers were coming and saying, my child was injured. And they said, nobody's listening to us. And I felt like I should listen to them and actually read the science. And that is what got me down into the time. And by the way, it's the worst career decision I have ever made. Debate, congenial, respectful debate is the fertilizer, it's the water, it's the sunlight for our democracy. We need to be talking to each other. And the First Amendment was not written for easy speech. It was written for the speech that nobody likes you for. This kind of division is more dangerous for our country than any time since the American Civil War. And how do we deal with that? We need to start being kind to each other. We need to start being respectful to each other. But it has to start here. A government that can censor its critics has license for every atrocity. It is the beginning of totalitarianism. There's never been a time in history when we look back and the guys who were censoring people were the good guys. All of us grew up reading Arthur Koestler, Aldous Huxley, George Orwell, and they were all saying the same thing. Once you start censoring, you're on your way to dystopia and totalitarianism.
I believe we're at a time of tremendous transition in this country, and things could go either way. We could see what Bobby Kennedy's been warning about for more than 20 years, which is an authoritarian, fascist state replace what we have and have been fighting to preserve ever since the Revolutionary War. back in 1776. We could see the country go that way. I believe that's quite possible. Or maybe there's light on the other side of this. Maybe it's not so dark as a lot of us fear. The Kennedys embodied something that is missing, we lost in this country with their assassinations. Something was trying to be born then. There was a change that was trying to happen that if it had been allowed to take place, it wouldn't be a perfect world, but we wouldn't be in this situation that we're in today with such terrible division in this country and so much hatred and so much fear. We'd have a different society. I think there are powers, whether they're corporate or otherwise, that have far too big a stake in our political life and our economic life. Bobby has become more aware of this as he's grown older. He's really representing the people that he talks about all the time, you know, the middle class and the have-nots in this country, to try to give them a stake.
And how do you handle the criticism and the attacks on you? How do you process that?
I think I understood from when I was a kid that if you're going to do anything important with your life, that people are going to attack you and that you're going to get criticism, you're going to lose friends, you're going to lose relationships. You know, there's going to be a hero's journey where you go through these tremendous hardships, where you go through the valley of death, you feel you're completely alone at some points. If you didn't go through that, it would not be very important. You know, I feel tremendously loved by my wife and by my children, my friends who are important to me. And I feel like, you know, everybody else is kind of playing. We're all walking through kind of a dream, right? And that, you know, life is a dream and that we have to treat it like that. And we have to be able to weather those difficulties without being ultimately affected by it and just focus on what we do, the choices that we actually get to make. That's ultimately the only thing that's important.
Bobby's first marriage was to Emily Black, and they had 2 children, but she was kind of a private person, and the public life was a lot for her to handle. And they began drifting apart soon after the kids were born. And at the same time, Bobby had known for some years Mary Richardson. And Mary was an architect. She was very beautiful, talented in so many ways. He'd known her for years, and there was nothing romantic between them. And then finally, one day there was. Bobby and Mary got married, and they ended up having 4 children. I knew them both quite well. Mary was an incredible person, really charming. I never saw any problems that she had, but privately she suffered from mental illness. And it was very, very difficult as their marriage progressed for her. And eventually she did commit suicide. And it was a terrible tragedy, again, for the Kennedy family, which had seen many of them.
My dad's relationships with his children are very important to him. He made sure that his children with Mary knew that she was sick. Because he has gone through so many personal events, I think he has a unique wisdom, especially when it comes to death. And he makes sure that everyone knows it might not be tomorrow, but everything's going to be okay.
The tragedies that he suffered are Shakespearean. I was there when Michael Kennedy died in Aspen when he hit a tree. He was playing football with his kids and myself. Bobby wasn't there. He's very, very resilient. I don't know how he did it. He says, I have a large family. Things happen in lots of families, and we have to go on. And his religion has just carried him through. It's unbelievable.
He then, not too long after that, married Cheryl Hines, his 3rd wife. She's an actress. She's one of the stars of Curb Your Enthusiasm. He met her, and he'd known her for some time through, fundraisers that his friend Larry David had organized, and she was the co-star with Larry David of that show. So they ended up getting together and getting married, and are married to this day.
I was interested in animals from when I was a kid, and I was always collecting, box turtles, baby raccoons. I had my pigeons. I had all kinds of lizards and snakes that I had caught, and I had dozens of aquariums that were filled with animals that I'd caught. And when my uncle was present, everybody was talking about Camelot, and I ended up reading a book about Camelot called The Once and Future King, and it was by T.H. White, a very well-known author, but he was also a falconer. And there's a chapter in it about falconry, about him learning falconry. And I read that, and it has such authentic detail. And I knew immediately that this is what I wanted to do. And I told my dad that I needed to get a hawk, and I needed to learn how to train him. There was a famous falconer who was one of the pioneers of American falconry, who lived only about 2 miles from my house. And his name was Alvin Nye, and he was at that time working at designing jets at the Pentagon. And he was my mentor. I apprenticed under him, so I've been training hawks ever since. And I breed hawks, and I was very active in it. I was the president of the New York State Falconer Association. I wrote the test, the exam that people take to become a falconer. I wrote the manual that was to pass that exam, and I just had hawks my whole life. I always had a bird, but I had them when I was at school. I always wanted to be in the woods flying the birds, and when I traveled, I would look up, try to find local falconers. And I went out hawking in Japan. I've been hawking in the Mideast, in Scotland, and Germany, and it remained a lifetime obsession.
He's a master falconer and has a deep feeling for birds and all creatures, really. He still goes on falconing trips and takes people along. When he was a kid, the walls of his house were festooned with images of St. Francis. And he wrote a children's book about St. Francis. He wrote several children's books, actually, in recent years. If there is one of the Catholic saints that he admires most, it would be St. Francis.
Bobby's confirmation name is Francis. In the Catholic religion, St. Francis was the saint that looked over and cared for animals. So our relationship grew from our love of animals and swapping animals back and forth that needed some care. Bobby was a licensed wildlife rehabilitator, and I was a licensed wildlife rehabilitator at the time. Bobby was rehabbing a bunch of baby crows that had fallen out of a nest. And in the middle of him rehabbing the crows, he had to go away, and he called me and he said, "Paul, would you be willing to take these baby crows for a week?" So I said, "Sure, Bobby," and I drove down to his house. Bobby was in the kitchen with a basket full of baby crows. He was telling me what he was feeding them and how he was feeding them and how he got them to open up their mouths so that they would eat. He says, "You gotta sound just like the mother." And he stood over the crows and going, "Ah, ah, ah, ah." And he says, "Now, can you do that? You gotta do it just like me." So I did it, and the baby crows opened up their mouths. And he said, "All right, now I trust that you can take them." Thank God I kept them alive for the week that Bobby was gone. And when he came back, first thing he did was, "How are my crows?"
My dad loves dogs. At one point, there was a puppy situation, and I think we had like 20. We had a deer, we had 2 emus, peacocks, chickens, the snapping turtle, the crocodiles. They weren't that nice, but they were fun. And a lot of them end up in the swimming pool as a sort of challenge, like, you better learn to swim fast. Basically, name a bird, we've probably had multiple of them. Lots of crows, lots of ravens, both of them mimic. My dad likes to teach them things. He had one named Poe, and I just remember it said, "Oh boy, oh boy, oh boy, oh boy, oh boy, oh boy, oh boy." And so they're fun. So he has the rehabilitation license in New York State, so all these animals that show up in people's backyards that have a broken wing or are injured, they end up at our house. And they're always in the house. Like, you walk into the house and there's like 5 turkeys sitting on the couch watching TV. And the emu's, the emu's taller than you. He has such a strong relationship with God, and the conduits are animals and nature. He looks around him, and that's how he sees God. Since the day I was born, his day begins, is dictated by, and ends with God and his alignment with God. He's wildly spiritual. As a witness of his behavior, he wakes up and he says his prayers. He prays to God, he prays to Saint Francis, who is his patron saint, and he prays every night for all the poor people, the sick people, the people in jail. Every meal is said with grace.
He has been to the bottom, knows what it's like down there, knows what pain is about and struggle, and what death is about, because he's seen a lot of it in his family and through the loss of his uncle and his father, through years of addiction that he's gone through and weathered the storm, through so many tragedies in his family and his brothers. One died of an overdose, another died in a skiing accident, and his second wife committed suicide. I mean, through all of that, he's a spiritual guy.
When I stay with him, I wake up and there's always a stack of books. Man's Search for Meaning. C.S. Lewis, he loves, the ancient philosophers as well. I think his experience as an addict when he was young, he went through a really, really hard time. And he understood a new kind of pain. I think he knows from that experience and really asking himself the big questions that life is suffering, and it's not all about you.
What sobriety did for me was it reoriented me and said, self-will is my enemy, and every opportunity that I get, I need to make this about service to other people and about service to God. It gave me the capacity to process pain in a different way, because pain for me prior to that was something that had to be escaped, because every incident of pain is an opportunity for spiritual growth, and pain and self-discipline are the touchstones of spiritual growth. I see every interaction that I have, every relationship is God talking to me. Even when somebody gives me the finger, because they don't like the way I drive, then I have to say to myself, that's God talking to me. What does he want me to learn from this incident? What new lesson am I supposed to learn?
His empathy for people is really unbelievable. He'll just reach out to anybody and help them along. I remember once, years ago, we were riding around on a Christmas Eve trying to find a church service, and a prostitute came up to us and, trying to solicit. We were with our spouses and girlfriends and stuff, but she didn't care. And Bobby said, well, listen, we're looking for a church service that we can go to. He said, why don't you come with us to church? And we took her to St. John the Divine up in Harlem. He treated her just wonderfully. He was special to her. It was an unbelievable, that's another example of something I would never do on my own. I mean, who picks up a prostitute and takes them to church? I mean, that's just crazy.
A lot of Christ's mission to me was a crusade against orthodoxies. He was constantly telling his followers that the rules and regulations are not what's important about your spiritual life. You can violate the rules, you can feed yourself and work on the Sabbath. He was constantly rebuking the clerics at that time, the Sadducees, the Pharisees, the scribes, for binding up heavy burdens for other men to carry. When his followers asked which one of us is going to be the highest, he would say the one who is the most service, and then he washed all of their feet. he would tell them that it's not what you put in your body that makes you unclean. It's the way that you conduct your lives, whether you conduct them with love and with selflessness, rather than obeying a certain set of rules and orthodoxies.
His life is totally screwed over by half the stuff he says. I mean, think about what he's done to his life. He was a prominent environmentalist with the hottest friends and the coolest life, and by the way, a bunch of money. Like, he threw it out the window because of something he believed in. He wants to make the world a better place. Unfortunately, the stories that are told about him do not portray that in any way. But I wish everyone could spend a day with him, see exactly how he is, how he behaves, what motivates him. Because it's not any kind of violent mindset. It's about making sure that the people who are suffering the most are suffering less.
Months before my dad died, he gave me a book. And my father would often give us books to read. He gave me a lot of different books, but he handed me this book, The Plague, by Camus, and said, I want you to read this. And he said it with a particular intensity. And then he was killed within maybe 6 weeks of that. So that book was sitting on my shelf, and I read it a couple of times because it seemed like a key to something that, I had to decipher. Why did he want me to read that with such intensity? And Camus, who wrote The Plague, he was kind of the legatee of the Stoics, that ancient philosophy of Stoicism. And The Plague was about a doctor who's living in a quarantine city in North Africa when a plague hits it. A lot of it is this conversation the doctor is having with himself about whether he should go out and do his job to heal people, to console them. But he's terrified because nobody knows what causes the plague. He doesn't have any way of treating it. He can't treat it any better than anybody else. And he knows that there's a high likelihood he's going to catch it and die if he goes out and helps other people. In the end, he goes out and does that because that's his duty. And Camus, the iconic hero of the Stoics, is Sisyphus. And Camus wrote another book about Sisyphus. Sisyphus was a mythic figure who offended the gods by doing something good for humanity, and he was sentenced for perpetuity to push a giant boulder up the hill. And he'd push it all day long. And at nightfall, he'd get it to the top and it would roll him and mangle him. And then he had to hike down and do it again. And he had to do that every day, forever. And most people would say that's pretty awful. That's a bad sentence. But for the Stoics, Sisyphus was a happy man because he put his shoulder to the wheel and he was doing his duty. And in doing that, taking the little thing that he was assigned to do and doing it well and doing it with diligence and relentlessly, he somehow was bringing order to an absurd universe. And the doctor who went out and treated the patients was doing the same thing. He was doing his duty. And whether the outcome was satisfactory or fulfilling was irrelevant. What's relevant is whether you're doing what you're supposed to do. And that turned out to be a very important message for me in the way that I live my life. Because it's not, about outcomes. It's about how you process reality and how you handle it. And the reality is that none of us have any power over anything except for this little piece of real estate inside of our own shoes. And, the outcome for everything is ultimately in God's hands, except about how we conduct ourselves. And the trick to life is to not have expectations, but just to know what your duty is and to do it. And if you don't have expectations, you'll never have disappointments. And if you don't have disappointments, you're never going to get crushed. And you become relentless. Nobody can defeat you. Because whether you win or lose is irrelevant. The only thing that's relevant is how you've conducted yourself in the battle. And that to me was a really important lesson in how to live life.